Okay. Welcome back to the FST5 Frontline Strong Together webinar series. We are so happy to be back with you guys. This month, we did take a bit of a break, but we are happy to be back. As you guys know, I am Manisha Leary, one of your co-hosts, along with Kobe Taylor, who is not looking his best today. So he is going to be the person that reads off our questions. And in his place, I am joined with Mike Mattern. Hey, Mike, how are you?
How are you?
Good. So, Mike, introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you, because I think this is your first time on as a co-host.
First time on as a co-host. Normally, I'm the co-host for the Minds on the Front Lines podcast, which is through Frontline Strong as well. And I'm also one of the peers that for the Frontline Strong program. So I got the phone call today to step in for Colby, and here I am. So I appreciate you having me on.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Kobe, I know we can't see you, dear. Would you like to say hello to everyone?
Yeah, thanks for being here tonight. My name's Kobe Taylor, one of the frontline peers, and I appreciate Mike jumping on with us. It's going to be a great webinar.
It is. We are super excited about our guest tonight. So without any ado, we are going to go ahead and get started. But as always, I want you guys to be mindful that this is a mental health and behavioral health podcast. So we talk about things that are a little heavy. So if you need to take a break or if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and send us questions through the Q&A and the chat. Again, we are sponsored and put on by FST5, which is Frontline Strong Together. You can learn more about the program at fst5.org. Or if you're in need of any resources or have any questions just about mental health and behavioral health in the state of Michigan, you can call 833-34-STRONG, 833-347-8766. Okay. So with that being said, I'm super excited to welcome you guys to Coming Home After a Tragedy. This is the topic of our webinar today, and we have an amazing speaker tonight. His name is Justin Templeton. We're super excited to have him. Justin is with us. He has, I think, over 22 years experience in the firefighter paramedic world. He's going to talk to us today about a tragedy that most of us know about that hit all of us very close to home. So I'm going to give Justin an opportunity to introduce himself because I'm super excited to have him. And whenever you're ready to get ready to start, Justin, we're ready to go.
Hi, everybody. My name's Justin, as Manisha pointed out, and I just can't tell you how excited I am here to be here. It's a little nerve-wracking at the same time, but I really do believe in Frontline Strong, and I think the work that these people are doing is an extremely important. So the thing that we're going to go over today is just it's a course that we put together after 22 years of experience. So yes, there are some things in there about a certain event that everybody's aware of, but it's kind of a lifetime of looking back that happened after that event. So kind of that waking up, that post-traumatic growth, that thought process that we all had. And I'd love for this to be pretty open. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them in the text boxes, and Kobe will redirect me, and you're not interrupting me. You're not bothering me. And at times, if I take some pauses, it's because it's extremely personal too. So that's not a place that I generally dive into. So as Manisha was nice enough to say, I've been a firefighter paramedic for 22 years, the last 19 or 18 and a half, somewhere in there. I've been at Oxford Fire Department. Before that, I skipped around. I'm not going to do a huge introduction because I think that's part of the story. So it's a class, but it's a class told through a story. So without talking too much, if it's okay with you, the folks at Frontline Strong, I'm going to go ahead and share some things and put my little presentation up on the screen here, and we'll just start working through it together. But like I said, it's important to me that if you feel the need to interject or ask anything, that's absolutely what we want you to do. So is there anything else that you need, Manisha, or?
No, yep. Just a reminder to our participants, if you want to send in something, questions, comments, any of those to our chat box. We also have our Q&A open as well. So you can go ahead and share now.
Awesome. So we'll just take a second to get it properly put up there. How's that looking?
Perfect.
All right.
Looks good.
So one of the things that's up here is post-traumatic growth, and it's kind of a phrase that's getting kind of large in our world, and we're going to dive into that. But coming home from tragedy and the road to post-traumatic growth is really what we're going to talk about. And in the next hour or so, I'm just going to share with you my experiences and how they kind of opened up my eyes and when that happened, and kind of on a timeline event. So thank you for having me. We went through that. The disclaimer here is pretty large, right? So I have a lot of jobs. I work for Oxford Fire Department full-time. I'm a training coordinator for the state of Michigan. I work for the North Oakland Training Group. I do a lot of things, but this has no affiliation with any of those things. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a doctor. I am a paramedic instructor coordinator. I am an instructor too in the fire service world. I'm a training coordinator, so I have some time speaking with people and educating. But this is just my opinion, and I want to make sure that that's extremely clear. It's not the opinion of the Oxford Fire Department or the state or any of that. And really, my hope today is to mesh some clinical data, some educational experience, a fair amount of life experience, and kind of mash it all up into a class that hopefully may present or prevent someone else from having to make or take 22 years to realize what it took me to kind of realize and to get where I'm at. Hoping to kind of expedite those things, or at least maybe change your path for you. With that being said, it's personal. So I put up there that I'm a little nervous. This is the third time I've put this on, so I'm a little less nervous than I was, right? But I teach about SCBA failures and hose line management and structure fires. This is a different world for me, and it's very personal. And I think that me telling it as a story and as a truth is the best way to do it. So just bear with me. It is extremely personal to me. So with that being said, I still am an EMS educator, so I have to put goals and objectives and all those things that kind of bind me in there. So hopefully today we're going to understand that stress and trauma will affect you during this career. You know, the bank teller version of you will not land in the same place that the first responder version of you will. It's just different pathways. It doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be bad. But pretending that we're the exact same person that we would be in a different line of work is just insanity. And we probably need to get away from that line of thought. One of the things that always bothers me, and I think that it does for everybody else, is people blame stress for horrible things that they did to other people. And I'm a huge, I think that you need to accept your roles in collateral damages and the responsibilities that we have around us. And that's one of the things that I wouldn't change some of the things that I would do for me, but I would definitely do it for the people around me. So taking responsibility for that is something that we're going to talk about today, because it's, even though there's some things driving us, it's still you and you're still responsible for it. And we're going to realize that positive growth after trauma is possible, and hopefully with the right tools, it doesn't have to take a lifetime to learn. You know, with any luck whatsoever, and hopefully putting some of these things out in front of you, it's a lot quicker path than 22 years. With that being said, this is a positive story, right? Like, I know that it kind of sets the stage for something gloomy, but really the end of this is all very positive. Those things were kind of our terminal objectives, but to streamline it a little bit, we're going to talk about cumulative stress and acute stress, you know, and I'm going to hopefully shine some light on some things that I didn't realize in the beginning of this career. You know, we were always told that you had to see something horrible to have any type of stress disorder or stress issues. And sometimes that's not it. You know, there's other things that weigh on us as first responders and take their toll over time. And we're going to relate to types of job-related stress and trauma and understand your role in those collateral damages. I hope at the end of this, we appreciate our ability to kind of facilitate and drive that growth ourselves. I'm a big personal responsibility kind of person. So I think that hopefully by the end of this, we'd see that. We'll figure out some different types of trauma. We'll value the idea of post-traumatic growth. That was huge for me to just understand it, put a name to it, put a word to it. It allowed me to drive into a better direction. Knowing that I was at the steering wheel, I think that was really important for me. And the biggest thing is just understanding that trauma isn't permanent, and we have the ability to drive our own healing. It's you know, you're not going to catch it if I stand too close to you. You know, we're not going to wear off on ourselves. So with that being said, definitions are huge. I don't know about you, but I came into a fire service 22 years ago that if you said anything about trauma or any of these other things, you got shunned to the hose room. So because it was a swear word, you know, it was very negative, very bad connotations that were attached to these things, and you couldn't trust that guy, right? But I want to read these things out loud, and I'm going to read them off the screen, which is something that I don't always do, but I think it's important to hear them and kind of just listen and resonate with it and see if that's something that maybe feels way more realistic. It's not a reach, right? So stress is defined as a state of worry or mental tension caused by a difficult situation. It sounds like a Tuesday, right? Like that's kind of what we do for a living. Trauma is deeply distressing or disturbing experience. If you've done this job for 7 minutes, you've probably experienced trauma. Whether or not you took it on as yours or not, that's a different story. But definition wise, this kind of put it into play for me, like, oh, this is something that we deal with. So it made it more realistic. A lot of time we talk about disorders or syndromes, and disorders defined as an illness or condition that disrupts normal physical or mental function or a state of confusion. Has anybody ever walked in their house after shift and had their spouse or somebody ask them something incredibly simple and snapped because you're just too high on that adrenaline still, or those other things? That's disrupting normal physical or mental function, right? So that's where we're at. This is a very normal part of our day-to-day lives. And the more that we accept that that's what it is and that it's here, it's part of us, it's what we do, the more that we can deal with it in a healthy manner, right? And syndrome is a group of symptoms which consistently occur together. A condition are characterized by a set of associated symptoms. I once had a doctor, and Manish will help me out with this, but I was like, what's the difference between PTSD and PTSS? And he said, well, one sends you home from work and the other one doesn't. So I thought that was one of the funnier syndrome. Well, you can still work with that, but if you got a disorder, you got to go home. So I don't know what I did here. So this kind of gets into that introduction that we skipped over. Today we're going to talk about my life and career. So rather than put on just a class for you, we're going to show all these things through a series of mistakes and a lifelong of learning, and kind of a thing that had light shine on it very light in my career. And hopefully during that time, some part of this relates to you. And if it doesn't, that's great too. And I just appreciate you being here. But the reality is, I think that if you sat in this seat for a while, some part of this, you're going to go, yeah, that was me. I'm going to create a timeline of relevant events, and that'll kind of introduce you to me as we go along today. And by the end of it, you'll get to know me. And we're going to relate some personal experience to both acute and cumulative stress and what my thoughts were coming into this career on what was what. So for me, I broke this into chapters, you know. So my chapter started off, I grew up in a town called Goodrich, Michigan, which nobody has ever heard of. There was 2 gas stations across the street from each other. They had the same name. I don't know why the heck we had 2 BP gas stations across the street, but we did. There's 2 schoolhouses, and I graduated with somewhere in the mid 80s of students. And you're sitting there going, what does this have to do with anything? But very small town, very tight-knit community. You know, these are the type of people that you have friends with your entire life. I knew every single person in my graduating class. You knew what you were going to be. You were going to be a fireman, a teacher, a cop, things that were tangible. You know, these names of things that you went off into office spaces in Chicago to do weren't even on the radar for people that grew up in Goodrich at that point, you know. At 17 years old, I attended a graduation party for an older girl, and I was complaining that my dad told me that I had to go to college and that I didn't know what I was going to college for. And this gentleman walked up to me and said, hey, you know how you can pacify that? You can take this $300, and yes, I'm dating myself, but a $300 EMT course. And I said, cool, what's an EMT? And he said, well, that's the guy that drives the ambulance around. I said, well, can I break the speed limit? Because that's what I like to do. And he said, yeah, sure, kid. And when I sat in that class, I got drawn into the fire service, and that's really how this started. It was a happy accident. But I say all this to say that to set the stage for kind of who I am and how I got to where I was. I was youngest of three brothers, had a great family life, but very old school. You know, we didn't talk about things. If you had issues, if you had a feeling, you threw it up, rubbed some dirt on it, and walked on. And I still don't necessarily think that that's always the worst way to go, but it set the stage for these things taking a little bit longer for me than what I would have hoped for them to have. I was the only EMT on an MFR department in the middle of nowhere that had a 40-minute response for ambulances at 18 years old. So my first calls were traumatic arrests and pediatric kids that were guys that I knew from town's children. These things were just how it was. And at 18 years old, they're like, hey, you're the EMT, not the MFR. So it's your call, right? So a lot of weight got placed on shoulders very young. I like to say that I really had a true baptism by fire. I decompressed like my second day as a paramedic, and things that you just normally don't do for long periods of time. But it's been an amazing career. I took a job working minimum wage on an ambulance company in the city of Flint. At the time, it was $5.75 an hour. And I wanted to go to paramedic school. So at the time, I took another job for Groveland Fire, working part-time, 72 hours a week, part-time. That's how it works in the emergency services, right? I worked 3 24s, and then I worked full-time in the city of Flint, and I went to school 2 nights a week to go through paramedic. So to say that I jumped 2 feet into this all at one time is an understatement. But I'm also in a group of people that I think probably did the exact same thing. We don't get paid a lot. Back then you had to build a resume, so the most things that you could stick on it, the more work you did, right? So we put all of our time and effort into this cup, right? This firefighter paramedic cup, and we start building a persona. So there's a person that you were your entire life, the guy that grew up with 87 kids that graduated from Goodrich High School, 2 gas stations across the street from each other. And I started building this firefighter paramedic, Justin. And the more time you spend away from one of them, the harder it gets to get back. And that'll kind of come to fruition a little bit farther into this conversation. And I mean, life was good. Don't get me wrong. It was just a lot of work. At 19 years old, I walked into a bank, and I saw this woman that I just fell head over heels for, and it was just amazing. And we spent 10 years like this. Every moment I had off, we flew around the world. We traveled, we did crazy things. We went all over the place, dove in the Galapagos. I've had the most privileged life I know what to do with. But during this time period, about 10 years goes by. And as those 10 years go by, we start to get to some critical points in first responder careers. You know, if we start looking at what happens in 10 years, there's some pretty disturbing statistical data that really gets into those time periods. Because I was still raised in that old school mentality, right? I didn't complain if I didn't have to. I worked 100 hours a week if I had to. These are just things that we did. And I don't think that any one of you sitting here listening to me that took the time out of your day to come here to do this is any different. This is how all of our careers started. 1 million hours, putting everything we had into one thing, never complaining about it, building a resume, working for $5 an hour. You know, you might have grown up in a different town or city, but I say all that. And during this time period, I worked part-time, paid on call, full-time, EMS in the city of Flint, EMS in Highland Park. I dabbled in all the places that you were. So really, with this being said, hopefully at this point, we've kind of related to each other to some degree. And I think that, I mean, I know I can look at Kobe, and I have had these conversations, and I know that Mike can probably go, yeah, that sounds like the same story of how I walked into this career. I worked too many hours. I did a lot of things, and it was good, you know? But during this time, you put very little time into yourself. You spend a lot of time filling up that work cup is what kind of the thing happens. So after 10 years, I noticed some changes in myself, and so some things started going on. Believe it or not, through all these things, younger ages, I was a partier, I had a good time, but I was never much of a daily drinker. But I found myself sitting on the back porch having beers by myself. And then it turned into, you know, having a bourbon off work by myself. I started having attachment disorders. So we talked about growing up in a small town and having the same friends, and I started to create storylines where they didn't want to hang out with me. you always blame somebody else because you can't be the one if it's somebody else. That's just how it works. And then because of that, some perceived isolation became very realistic. And a thing that I later realized is something that my wife told me many years later is she now asks me, and I'll get to this later, but it's kind of a funny story. She now asks me, like, she'll tell me sometimes that, hey, Lieutenant Templeton came home. Can you go back out to the car and get my husband and walk back in? Because that'd be great. Because I tell you, she's not a big fan, and neither are your friends. So these perceived isolation disorders became true, right? So I stopped coming home, hence the name of this. And the alter ego took over after 10 years of colonization, all these things. And what we're really talking about here is getting into some definitions. I didn't think I was depressed. I would have never admitted to that. People around me would tell you differently. I was very, very self-deprecating. That's still something that I work on today. I had some disillusion about things, a lot of guilt about some bad calls, some things that went on. Maybe I did this, maybe I could. I played the what if game a lot. And those of you in the audience that know what that is, it's not a fun game to play. And I started to develop a gross disregard for safety. I would isolate myself. I'm a big motorcycle proponent. I love them. I'd get on my Harley with no change of clothes, a bottle of bourbon, put it in the saddlebag, and disappear on my 4-day and come back at the end of it to go back to work. I was starting to avoid the time where I could be Justin and only spend time being the firefighter version of myself. And then one day I walked in and I realized some things were going on. I couldn't put my finger on it because I just wasn't raised with the tools. I didn't have them. I didn't groom those things in myself to really put my finger on it. And I walked through the door of our house and I looked at the person that I'd been with almost 11 years. And I said, hey, I think I'm having a problem. I think there's something going on and I can't put my finger on it. And she said, and I thought this was because she didn't care, but she looked at me and she said, well, what are you going to do? Leave me? And I said, well, it's a pretty good idea. And I thought about it for a day or two and I walked back in the next day because I sure wasn't going to talk to her about it, right? Like that would be blasphemous. Why would we have a conversation? Can't talk about feelings. I tried that once and she shot me down, right? And I walked in the door the next couple days later and I said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. You should pack your stuff and get out. So I literally took all these things. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I'm doing all these things that just aren't me. And I walked in, I was reckless. And I set the world on fire just to watch it burn. I didn't know at the time that sometime pine forests they need to burn down for growth. I didn't realize that at the time, but that's where I needed to be. I needed to burn everything down to hit rock bottom. And at the time, don't get me wrong, I had no idea of any of this. I just knew I was angry, that things weren't going well. And that's where I was at. So later on, looking back at this, Yale released chronic stress indicators. So I'm not really making this up. So if we read through these, like aches and pains, insomnia, sleeplessness, I went 72 hours without sleeping during this time period. If you ever want to know what weird thoughts are in your head, just stay awake for 72 hours and you'll meet them. It's kind of not cool. Changes in social behaviors, not talking to friends that I've known my entire life, leaving a woman that I've been with and had a great relationship for 11 years. Does anything on this list ring true to chronic stress indicators? I worked 120 hours a week. I still worked 2 full-time jobs in this field during that time period just because I wanted to. Change in appetite. I got down to 165 pounds. I'm 6'2". That's a little light for me. Obviously, I was drinking a little bit more, changing emotional responses to others and emotional withdrawal. So I didn't know this at the time, but when we read this list, it's pretty blatantly obvious that it was a chronic stress problem, right? And when I figured this out, what I like to think of it as is a bucket, right? So take a little ride with me. Everybody has a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket. Everybody can envision that in their head. It's a pretty easy thing, the orange silly bucket, right? So throughout our lives, before we ever come into this, things get put in that bucket. It's up to us to take things out of it, but that's our stress bucket. In other groups, I call it my bullshit bucket. There's only so much bullshit I can handle. So pardon my French if that offends you, but that's where I'm at in life. So we come into this career and our buckets could have different amounts of things in them, or they could all be empty. It has nothing to do with me. I don't know where you're at, but every time we put something in it and we don't do anything about it, it fills up. And the problem is when that overflows onto the people around us, our family, our friends, our things that are around us, their hands are leaning on that bucket because you're their pillar of strength. And you're pouring that stress onto them. It overflows and it gets onto them. And that was what was finally hard for me, is when I watched it burn down the world. I wasn't going to change what I was doing for myself, but watching it burn down the people and the relationships that I had for my entire life was what was the thing for me. During this time period, I can tell you that I didn't believe that there was any stress disorder to it. And the reason why is extremely simple. I knew is the word that I chose there on purpose, but I knew that I didn't have any stress problems because there wasn't one single call that I went home from and was like, man, I didn't sleep after that. Because that's what we were told. We were told that in order to have a stress problem, you had to see this horrible thing, and then you had to go home and immediately have a problem because of it. So at this point, I'm probably suffering from a chronic stress disorder. And another way to look at this, if you buy into polyvagal syndrome, is which I put up on your stream here. So normal people operate in ventral vagal, right? We would know this as our day-to-day response, right? That's just how we are. We're happy, we're go-lucky, we're curious, we're open, we're mindful, present, settled, grounded, all those good things, good partners, good family, good friends, good medics. The problem with being a first responder is we spend incredibly long periods of time in this middle ground. And we actually retune our bodies. So most people, when they have a sympathetic response, their heart rate goes up, their blood pressure goes up. And if you could think back to when you were brand new into the first responder world, you probably did. Your heart rate went up, all those things. And now you almost have the opposite reaction to it. And to me, what's happened there is we've normalized a sympathetic response, and that's now our baseline. Anybody in the audience always have to sit with their back against a wall if they're in a restaurant, watch the door, gunner position, right? All these things are things that are there. So once we normalize that for so long, and then you take things like 24-hour shift life into it, it takes as much time as you were in that to come back out of it. So if I work at 24 and then I go home for 24, I might never leave that sympathetic response, really meaning that I really never went home, right? I was still in this other thing, filling up that bucket. And we talked briefly about going off about something silly, walking through the door and yelling about something that didn't matter, or locking up and freezing. That was never anything for me. I have an amazing temper. I still do. It's way better than it used to be. But when you're normalizing the yellow zone, your only response is going up to red. And once you stay in that yellow for so long, you kind of lose those neural pathways to get back to normal you. And to me, that was a good rationalization of what was going on in my mind, and why people didn't want to be around me. You know, that perceived isolation became very real because I was this guy. The yellow guy is Lieutenant Templeton, the green guy is Justin, right? Like, and I stopped returning to that, thusly stopping going home. So statistically, one of the crazy things for me is this was about 11 years into my career. Statistically speaking, the divorce rate in first responders skyrockets between year 9 and year 11. All these things have massively heightened things. Abuse of both substances and spousal abuse go through the roof in those same time periods. The second time period for that is after retirement, and that's for a whole different set of reasons. But it's all loss of self. It's all these things where we don't come back in. We still want to control the thing, where everything's about control, about safety, about all these other things that your normal life, the green you, isn't as concerned about. So this was my rationalization for it. And obviously other people thought there was some value to it because I stole it from somebody. It wasn't my own personal thought, but that was where we were there. So with that, I want you to ask yourselves here, like, if any of that sounds familiar, you know, can you honestly say that the same you is coming home? And then if you're asking yourself, or you're saying, man, my spouse she doesn't like me anymore. Well, does she not like you, or does she not like you, the you that's coming home? Does she not like the alter ego of you, right? But for me, one drop at a time, that bucket filled up. There was no giant effect. There was nothing else. I didn't decompress. I didn't spend any time becoming me in between. I worked 2 jobs. So I went from private EMS in the city to firefighting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, 12 hours off, maybe in between 36-hour shifts. And for me, it was definitely everybody else's fault because I was just working. And part of that comes back to that educational problem of, I knew that it wasn't post-traumatic stress. I knew that it wasn't chronic stress. And I knew that I didn't have a syndrome or a problem because nothing happened. Because that's how these things were presented to me. So part of my reason for sharing that story that I actually really don't like sharing is because it's realistic, right? I was told some false input and it got false output. And hopefully with the right tools and understanding these things early enough and knowing what to look out and maybe just hearing, hey, this kind of sounds familiar. Am I making sure that I'm coming home after shift? Maybe this doesn't take burning the world down at 11 years for it to change for you. Maybe it doesn't. But luckily for me, during this time period, life's got to go on, right? This is quite a while ago for me. So one of the key words that a lot of people use is resilience. And I think it's used improperly. Properly. I used to think that resilience meant, man, I can muster up. It was no different than brushing it off, right? I had somebody tell me once that resilience is actually a synonym with balance. It's ensuring that you're still there. It's becoming balanced. At this point, I didn't realize that though. So my definition of resilience was, I'm good. We're going to push on. And I started doing what I believed was rebuilding. So I had some self-realization. I realized what I did, that I was doing things silly. I stopped being so reckless. I became accountable. But self-realization in this area, when you're not resilient, is some dangerous ground to walk on. So not liking yourself, that self-deprecation, that part of it gets a lot worse. I'd come to terms with who I'd become, which was really the alter ego. I had taken on that persona wholeheartedly. It was all I was, and that's dangerous grounds to be walking on. I lost sight of the person I was. I didn't hunt anymore. I didn't fish. I didn't hike. I didn't do any of those things. I poured myself into work because it worked. And I thought that I was healing through that. And I really did start to grow some new relationships because weirdly enough, people that are doing the same thing as you, because there's a lot of us that do that, we pour ourselves into work. We hang out, and you think that there's, it's a club. You think that there's some good relationship growth going on there, and you're like, oh, this is good. If Johnny's doing all the same things and working like a crazy fool, and we hang out, we got each other, the world's great. And then some time went on. So post-traumatic growth, we talked about. So at this point, I was not brutally honest. I didn't have a whole lot of optimism. I definitely had extreme perception of control over events. I really thought that I could control everything. My coping style bordered between reckless and not reckless. Who knows what it was? And I did have a strong sense of self as my alter ego as a firefighter, right? Like I had a very strong sense of self there. So I had this very good perception that I had moved through growth. But perception and reality, I don't think quite sat with each other yet. So, as we move forward, I started building some armor up. I started seeing some disorder to growth. So I was more effective. I was doing things. I thought that was growth. I cloaked myself in knowledge. So during this time period, I really took control over what I was doing. I drove my career in the direction that I wanted it to go. I became an EMS IC. I took over the fire academy. I saw a lot of things go on. I got promoted. A lot of things from on my work side of life were going the way that I did, which is what happens when you pour all of your energy into one thing. It really went very well for me. Part of the reason I did that, I wanted to be the best provider that I could, best fireman that I could. I buried myself in my trade. I spent every minute that I could training, working. I never wanted to play the what if a game again. I realized what that was. And at this point, I was aware of what the what if game was. What if I would have done something else? Really, I just became arrogant and cocky, which was effective at the time. But I was promoted. I was an educator, course manager. And I heard in the circles that we were running in like, hey, I'd like that guy to be in the truck with me. And that felt good, right? Like that was like bad calls, fires. I was the reliable set of hands to stand next to you. And it really did cure the what if problem. So I like to put that I was well-adjusted-ish, right? Work life was a dream. I really started over. I had the promotion that I wanted. I'm 16 years into my career at this point. Things are going well. And my personal life is starting to come back together. I got friends, I got things, I do things. It's great. So I want to set a stage for you here by showing you this picture. And they'd hate if they knew that they were on here. And if I can get this thing to stop moving around. Sorry. I can't get this to go in the corner. All right. So in this photo, never mind the terrible mustache that I have sharing with you there. So I'm sorry about that. But this is what my work life looked like at the time. So Cap, the bald guy in the front, went through Fire Academy the year that I was born. He's got 40 years in the fire service. I got Ben, who's got 5. Ricky at the time's got 3. Chris has got about a year. And Johnny, the short fellow that's sitting next to me, has got about 3.5 years in the fire service. And this is just an absolute dream. I got a brand new dream team crew. We're building things out the way that we want them to be. I just got promoted. I have a terrible mustache. I'm really just living the life, right? Like things are going the right direction. Got a young crew. And all of you out in the audience can probably, if you're ever taken on the role of a company officer, trying to change a bunch of salty old dogs is definitely the more negative the aspect of that than jumping into, hey, I got new people, I can mold them how I want, right? They don't know any better. They don't have any bad attitudes yet, things. So really things are going about as good as they can be. Like work life is an absolute dream. These guys are rock stars. I can't tell you how much they are my family. This is my 6-man crew. We're up to 8 now, but this was the 6 that were there then. And they're goofy, they're quirky, but I'd put them against anybody in the world. They're as good as it gets. So really the fairy tale kind of begins there. So this is the hopeful part, right? So we saw what chronic stress disorder can do, what we can drag you down to and what you can do. And if you drive yourself back and get back in the steering wheel, and drive yourself back up. I met my wife and I was older, right? So we got married right away. We got married in 8/8 of 2020. So we're hitting a timeline here, and 7/11 of 21, we welcomed a daughter into the world. So those are important dates because she gets free Slurpees for life, but more so just things are happening quick, right? I just got promoted, got a brand new crew, got married, had a child, all fantastic things. I batted way outside of my league, right? So if I put these pictures up there because my wife's gorgeous, it's just a thing. But things were going great. Smiley, happy guy, taking off on the motorcycle from our wedding. This is my daughter when she's born. She's 3 years old now, but she's still just as cute as she was then. But just amazing life. All the things that you ever wanted, I drove this thing back in the right direction. So really, at this point, I don't have a better way to put it than work's awesome. It's a fairy tale. Life's fantastic. And then November 30th, 2021. So 7/11, my daughter's born. 8/8/20. I get married. I just took over a new crew. November 30th, 2021, I'm sitting at Station 2 with Johnny, who's got 3.5 years in the service, and we're sitting around the coffee table talking about how Sheer, we call him Squints, so you can picture who that was. If you've ever seen The Sandlot, it's Squints. So all these guys have nicknames. I probably should just use their nicknames, but how Squints hadn't been tested. You know, he just needs a couple bad calls under his belt to see how he acts, and he doesn't talk enough. We gotta work these things out. A couple minutes later, we get called to a shooting at the high school. It's in the morning. We respond. We get drafted away to another shooting victim just off site, and we get back. And it was my truck's job to triage patients that day. So we walked into a hallway where there were 4 students, and I was met by a couple of the people that I work with, and I couldn't figure out why they were there. And it's because they went to a very different call than I did. So 2 of the best paramedics I ever met from a different shift were standing there trying to triage. And I don't mean this in a negative way. They were kind of struggling with what to do. Like, do I black tag? Do I red tag? What do I do here? And I couldn't figure out why they were there. And I really paused for a moment. And the reality is, this is a small town, folks. They got called by their kids to come get them, and they were rolling over bodies to not triage them, but to make sure it wasn't their children. So these men that are incredible providers, they had pause in them, but not because they weren't doing their job. It's because that's not what they were there to do. So I say that to just like, when you look at people and you say, hey, there's two things here. When we say, hey, I went to the same call as you, why are you having an issue with it? Their bucket has different things in it. We talked about buckets, right? And the other thing is, they might be going to something different than you. It might relate to them differently. And this was like the most blatant version of that I've ever thought of in my life. Like, they literally went to a different call than I did. So during that time period, I had the unfortunate task of triaging some kids. And as we rolled one girl over that was still talking to us and pronounced another, I noticed that she had a bullet hole through her chest exiting out her other side. And I found that exit wound by trying to pick her up off the ground when my index finger slid into it, because it was on the opposite shoulder. So I picked her up. She screamed because of that. We put her on a stretcher, and I started triaging her, triaged. I treated her, took her to the hospital. And in my mind, walking into that hallway, the school's shaped like a giant octagon, and it's huge. It almost takes up a square mile of space. It's one of the largest school footprints in the state of Michigan. Every hallway in that school looked like that. So I had to go dump her at the hospital and come do this over and over and over again until the sun went down. That's what's going through my mind. And the weirdest thing was, she was just calm as a cucumber. And one of the other girls that was shot through the neck was sitting there just staring me in the face and said, hey, help them. They're worse out. You know, like, it's not in the movies. But the end toll of that day was that 3 students were to die that day. 7 students and another teacher were to be critically injured. And then the next day, a 4th student would pass away at the hospital. So this is something that really did change the trajectory of our crew, of our life, of everything around us. And I didn't go to the same call as everybody that went with me. I don't live in the community. A lot of these guys do. A lot of these guys went there to find their loved ones. But the unfortunate toll that day was Madison Baldwin, Tate Muir. Madison was 17 years old and she was executed that day. Tate was 16. Justin died the next day at this hospital at 17 years old, and Hannah was the girl that was lying right next to Kylie, 14 years old, that died in that hallway while I looked at her. And that was the toll of that day immediately. Now, the toll of that day would go on for days and days and days, because one of the things that nobody teaches you about any of these things is when you go back to service, it doesn't end there. So what my days and life looked like after that, I immediately returned back to service because I thought, once again, that there was hallways filled with kids that looked like this. I sat in a line and I collected data. We went to CISD, peer-to-peer. We literally just had meetings with acronyms, with meetings, with acronyms, with meetings for days on end. We met with everybody. I was in second in command on the shift side that day. Obviously, there's a lot of people that came back in. So we had a lot of meetings. I spent a bunch of time trying to be the best boss possible. I checked on my guys, their wives. We called everybody. I didn't leave work, right? Like, I just kept doing these things over and over and over again to make sure that I was trying to be the best new boss that I could be and be available for the people that were around me. And I don't want you to take this wrong, but the job itself, treating people at this point in my life, is easy. Treating those human beings that were there was something that I did. It's something I was prepared to do. It wasn't that big. Protective cloak worked, right? I buried myself in the trade and I was good at it. Or so I thought. So this is another time that I was mistaken in what the things are that can get after you. So I painted you a really cool picture about a brand new crew, a brand new wife, a brand new kid. But what didn't I mention during this time period while I went to work? And we're talking a month of being completely inundated with this call. Every day you walk into work, this is all you hear about all day. You don't leave work. You go to more acronym meetings. You go do these things. I didn't mention being a husband. I didn't mention being a parent. I didn't mention being a friend. And days turned to weeks. The reality is, if you look at that fairy tale that I told you about, the other side of that fairy tale is I don't know how to be a company officer. My crew doesn't know how to cope with this. They're all brand new paramedics. I just got done literally that morning talking about how we needed to, Squints needed to be tested. And 3 minutes later, we went to a mass casualty event at the high school. So there's two sides to every story, right? The fairy tale that everybody shows you, or the one that I would already told you, might not look like that. So when you sit there and you talk to people and you say, oh man, I don't know what they're complaining about. Look at all they got. Well, look at all I had. But the reality is I have no idea how to do any of it. Being brand new is being brand new. Right? None of us had gone through a school shooting before. So this whole process is brand new. It looked really shiny on the outside, but the reality is November 30th to January 7th, I was inundated by this call. Much like in the beginning of my life, I was inundated by 3 jobs. I physically came home in between those time periods, but my mind never did. January 7th was the day that Kylie, the girl that I took to the hospital that fortunately lived so that I can have one heck of a beautiful story to tell, got shipped out to rehab from the hospital. She left the hospital. She was no longer critical. A bullet entered her right clavicle, hit her right shoulder blade, skipped across her spine, missed all of her arteries, and came out underneath her left armpit. That's the injuries that she almost got paralyzed for. But on January 7th, she went home. And for some reason, that was attached to something in my brain. When she went home, I could go home. And at that day, Justin, and I walked through the door for the first time. So I came home from it. The call, the treatment, none of those things got me. The effects on my family did. I came home and I was actually paying attention to what my wife was saying for me for the first time, and that my daughter didn't want me to read to her, and all these things were different. She didn't recognize me. After almost 30 days of not coming home, the amount of damage that you can cause to people in your immediate circle that they don't understand. You just sit there and go, well, I have to, it's work. I have to, it's work. I have to, it's work. And you don't communicate those things is amazing. And that's collateral damage that I have to live with, right? Like those are things that I had to brush back up, and I did that, right? Just because I can sit there and say, well, I was at work, of course I had to do these things. Well, just because that's true doesn't mean that her story of being alone at home and having a zombie walk through the door and somebody she doesn't know, that's also true, right? So that's what got very real for me this time. And the biggest thing is, I'll tell you that new growth can only really accrue after fire. And I'm kind of a naturalist. I love being outdoors. I love doing things outside. But you know, a pine forest can't grow until you light it on fire. And sometimes I think that our lives mimic that. And for the second time, I thought I was going to burn down my life by doing this. But shortly thereafter, this is Kylie, and if she did allow us to put this up here. She came in and she saw us, and she wanted to make sure that we knew that she could walk and that we had something to go out of this. And what this young lady did for me was she allowed me to put something as heinous as a school shooting. I think that we have a tendency of, if I asked anybody in the crowd, hey, what are the worst 3 calls that you've ever been on? I would never do that. It's just a rude thing that people do. But you'd be able to articulate it. You wouldn't share it with me because we're too big for that, right? We wouldn't do it. But you'd be able to put them in the back of your gray matter. What I would challenge you to do is, every last one of you has 9,000 wins for every one loss, right? This young lady allowed me to put this call into a win category. As terrible as that sounds, this is a win for me. I was able to positively affect this young lady's life and keep her alive to the hospital. I played a role in that, and that's a positive for me. And that's that optimism, right? So at this point, I became brutally honest and optimistic. And that's what that was for me. When I could put her into a win category because she lived. I didn't shoot anybody that day, but I did help one girl. I had some perception of control over the events. My coping style became a lot more positive, and I had a huge, strong sense of self. So at this point, I am actually seeing some real post-traumatic growth. The other thing that occurred here that at this point, we talked about chapter 1, right? Cumulative stress disorder. chapter 1 all the way to this point was somebody else's fault. A light bulb literally turned on after this call, and I could admit that the last 20 years of my life, I drove the boat. I started working on relationships that had lost 10 years prior. I started rebuilding my marriage. I started working on making sure that I put things in the Justin box and not just the firefighter paramedic box. I promote counseling for anybody, especially new marriage. Like, we got married after knowing each other for a year, right? Like, what do you know about each other? You got to figure it out. Like, all these things are there. But real growth began after this. So everything that we've talked about, I had no knowledge of it the way that I do now until the end of this, because of post-traumatic growth, because of that brutal optimism, because that light bulb finally turning on and allowing me to see it. And it really comes down to opposing truths, right? Rather than sitting there and fighting the people close to us. The reality is I did need to be at work, but her reality is that she was alone. The outside reality is that I had everything that I ever wanted, but the inside reality is I didn't know how to do any of it. I'm responsible for the people that are hurt. When you do those things in your life, that is you. You are responsible for it. You're responsible to go fix it. Just because you had some things happen to you doesn't mean that you can turn it around and spread it on everybody else. Some things that worked for me that I started doing, I believe in grounding. And like I said, I'm a naturalist. I put my feet on the ground when I get home and make sure that I'm walking through the door. And this is actually part of it for me too, right? So a stronger and more open relationship. So this is about as open as I can get. This is the best way that I can put on what these cumulative and acute stressors are, is by telling you that in 22 years, it took me a lifetime to realize what they were. And I'm the kind of guy that had to hit my thumb with a hammer multiple times to know that it hurt. But it kind of brings us to the lesson. Growth through trauma is possible. Disorder and growth can be rhythmic, right? I just showed you through a career that I thought I knew what it was multiple times and I didn't. Collateral damages are yours to own. They do happen, but it's like yours. One of the things that we need to do, we got to start putting this information in front of people early. Getting it out there. We've actually changed a part of this class and done a different version of it. I still run a fire academy. We put this out to first responders as they come in. A version of it. It's not as intimate. It's not as about me, but it's a version of it. I think that there should be some mandatory education. And the biggest thing is to believe that the you that's a bank teller or that worked at the auto parts store is going to be the same as the first responder. One is just insanity. If I asked everybody in the audience to tell me what your three largest priorities are and choose people, everybody out there would tell me my wife, my kids, and you'd give names to it. And I'd tell you, it's a fun game to play, right? And you'd say Jennifer, Lizzie, whatever, right? And then you give me these three things. And then if I ask you how much percentage of your time you're putting into those things, you'd give me, if you were honest, probably some horrifically low number. So you got to start prioritizing your priorities. If you're allowed to say that, hey, my wife and my two kids are my priorities, then why am I spending 2/3, 3/3, all of my time and life and energy focusing on something that isn't that? Why am I only watering the grass on the only other side of the fence and wondering why this grass died? Check in with the people around you. Decompress. If you have a hard day, take the day off if you need to. Go home. Actually make sure that you walk through the door though, because this imposter that walks through, other people won't be able to put a finger on it, but I guarantee you they'll feel it. Trauma, it's not I don't believe it's a disease. You can't get it. If I sneeze on you, you won't get trauma. With the right tools, upfront conversations in the beginning of the careers, we can soften these things and make them a lot less detrimental than they were or than they have to be. And that healing and growth can be rhythmic. And it'll happen, and it'll present itself in a lot of different ways in your career. And then just leave it on a really positive note. This young lady, I was able to watch her walk and graduate the next year. So like, this is a huge win. Like, it's not the story that you thought I was going to tell. I'm not sitting here crying about a school shooting. I'm extremely happy to know her, and she actually wants to get into physical therapy. She does a lot of public speaking, and she is just a gem of a human being. But truly, I didn't know any of these things without meeting her. So, and then just on another fun, positive, personal note, we welcomed my son Ellis into the world last year. and we're really working on repairing all those things, and it's definitely gone in the right direction. But all in all, this is just my story, right? And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you listening to it. And I'd love to hear some questions or interject with you. I'm sorry I came so close to time here, but that is my story. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this, and hopefully we can have a little facilitated conversation with everybody.
Dustin, thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. And thank you so much for being vulnerable, sharing your story in an open and honest way. I just want to remind our participants that you can put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box if you have any questions for us. But I will start off our questions. So you mentioned having a bucket for like Justin instead of, firefighter, things like that. How is that bucket going? Are you finding that you're equally putting more into your Justin bucket now on the other side of coming home?
You know, I gotta admit, I've been honest with you this whole way, and I'm gonna continue to. So, but it's difficult for me, and it's one of those things that you gotta realize during my developmental ages, right? Like I spent a lot of time creating neural pathways of you fix this by working harder, you fix this by working harder. My diversion, when I'm tired, my thing that I lean into is work. I have found that my wife's amazing. She's brutal. But she'll tell me, right? Like we've had these conversations. She understands what it is, and she'll flat out ask me, "Are you doing this because that's the direction that's easier to go? You need to go do something on the other side. You need to put some time in over there." But it's because we could have this conversation, and she's became my yellow line, where I always veered white. I always went to the right side of the road, and she's keeping some boundaries for me. So while I do consciously have that, it's a struggle. It's difficult. I spent a lot of years working 1,000,000 hours, and that's the easy direction for me to go. And I'm way better at it than I was, but it's not perfect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. In the mental health world, it's the same way. I just have one other follow-up question about the presentation. So I'm so happy that you showed the polyvagal chart. It's super important for kind of people to see that freeze, the fight or flight, and then kind of the rest, the kind of more calming area. So you mentioned that you found yourself kind of being in that first 10 years, you kind of found yourself being in the fight or flight, and then increasingly going to the freeze area and not being able to come down from that. Do you feel like you are a little bit lower now? Are you down in the green area where you're able to bring yourself back more to a regulated state?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's those things that like you see it knee-jerk reactions when you walk through the door and somebody, your wife hands you a kid and says, "God, she's just been crying," and you're like, "What?" And you yell back, "I just dealt with 7 overdoses. What?" And her thought was perfectly fine. I don't have those responses anymore. You feel like you're back down there. I won't lie though, there's just once again a lot of neural pathways that kept me in that middle. I normalized the yellow zone, right? Like that was my day to day. And I think that that's probably true of a lot of first responders. But I'm conscious about it, and it's a work in progress, but I definitely live, and my kids have forced that on me, right? Like it's a forced go down to the green and sit on the ground and play with them, and you can't live in yellow and play with kids. So that's kind of been a saving grace for me is that too. So yes, long story.
Nice. Man, thank you. You did an awesome job. We got some questions in the Q&A for you. One coming from Christy, who's one of our own peers as well. Says, "Thank you for sharing. I think your story rings true with many that have been in the service for several years. If I may ask, did you ever go into traditional therapy?"
Yeah, no, I've actually tried a bunch of them, right? Like don't be afraid to fire your therapist, right? That's what I tell her. If the shoe doesn't fit, find a different shoe. I've tried it all. I've finally got, and that was something that was crazy for me. Like I grew up in a house, so you don't go to therapy, you don't talk about those things, you don't do anything. But I actually still see a therapist. We saw a couple counselors forever. I go to a therapist every couple of weeks, just check in, make sure things are going right, and make sure that I'm. That's what I mean by checking in. It's if you don't have a huge colony of people, sometimes you got to check in with other people, and having a professional on your team that you trust, great thing to do. And really for me at this point, we just chat, make sure that everything's good. If it's good, it's good. If it's not, bend a little bit, give me some tools that I need, and get back after life, man. Thank you, Christy.
Awesome. We got one from Randy. Did you find that after you went through the call, did you find you wanted to go back to your first stage, like wanting to drink again and doing some of your old habits?
So for me in that new role, I was so um and so weirdly enough, like a lot of people have drinking problems, and I drank to be able to try to come back down to green, right? So that's another thing to talk about. Like I was just trying to like regulate back down. I've never had an addiction issue with alcohol, so like during that time period, I didn't like resort back to it. I didn't even know that I was stuck up there. I was so busy that it wasn't even an option. I was so busy worrying about guys and things and acronym soup and all the other stuff that we had to do that no, I really didn't, weirdly enough.
Perfect. We got a few comments that from Steve. Thank you for sharing your story. I cannot agree with you more that all FR need access to mental health tools, and that's something that we're still trying to work on, and hopefully trying to get that into some academies and changing the curriculum a little bit. I know Mike's working hard on that, and we're hoping to bring that to a platform for all academies to follow. So
Yep.
I too couldn't agree more.
So,
One from
and
Robert.
we put so from the state point of view, like Frontline Strong, like your information is mandatory in the orientations at the state level for all fire academies. We went one further for our fire academy, and we actually one of the classes in it is a mental health awareness. And you know, because it's one of those things that goes by. There's a reason why 70% of first responders get divorced at 10 years. Like the national standard's only 49%, folks. We're doing something wrong. So just put it out there as and a little bit of self-realization. Like even if it's stuff like that, like I know everybody else is focused on let's make sure people don't commit suicide and don't have these things. Like that's great to focus on, but I think that we can just not screw up our lives to where they're incomprehensibly dumb either. You know, we don't need to do the things that we're doing to the people around us. And that's always been my focus on it. So sorry, Kobe.
No, I agree, man. One from Robert. Knowing what we are getting into when joining EMS, my class instructor said people will die on you, but it was a casual statement. I had no idea what I was walking into. I think any of us been in this profession long enough, we've heard that a few times and hoping to change that. Another one from Jennifer. As a first responder wife and nurse, did you notice a difference between each relationship, such as their ability to understand based on their own profession? Or was it more based on your growth and understanding of yourself and how you put yourself into each relationship?
I think that it's mainly on us, right? Even if you know, I did date a couple first responders in there, and I don't. It was not for me. I feel like we played the yeah, but I did this today game too much. But it's and but it they were definitely different. But it's just all individuals. You know, I guess I didn't relate it that way to a career. But about the statement that you said before that, you know, you talked about somebody said that their instructor said, yeah, people will die on you. Why don't we start? Why don't we change that? Why don't we change our attitudes on it? Like when you have somebody that's talking about losses, why don't you redirect them to the win category? Like, hey, tell me about some of the greatest things that you've done. Like what has this given you? We focus on this micro part of our career where we talk about what it took away from us. And it's just because we're brutally negative human beings. We fill in those blanks with those horrible facts. Anybody sitting here could tell me that they've done way more awesome things for people than they ever had losses, right? Like, and if you can't, it's made up in your mind. Like, that's the truth of it. So
Awesome. Okay. Is that all the questions, Kobe?
Nope. We have another one came in from Susan. Great presentation. What would be your advice to other leadership who may be resistant to talking about mental health to their crews? And well, it's a tough one there. You could be honest.
So remember that leadership can come in a lot of different ways, right? So to be a leader, you don't have to be management. I think that we have a really bad time in our careers where we sit there and we say, well, the management should do something about it. And we use the term leadership interchangeably. I think that the company officer role is one of the most pivotal roles, but one of the things that we don't talk about is the young guys, right? Like the young guys and gals that are in this. You can lead from the bottom on these things, and if you make it important, it'll be important. Unfortunately, it is hard to change old dogs. If you have a leader in that role, though, if you're actually talking about leadership and not management, that person will hear what the people need and they'll give them to them, because that's part of leading, and they'll stand in front of them and do it. One of the reasons why I finally figured this out is, and I'm not trying to say that I'm some great leader, because I've already told you that I have no idea what I'm doing. But I went to a to the rescue meeting after this thing because our chief, unfortunately, had learned this lesson through having a suicide on his previous department. So he learned the weight of these things. And when we had this event happen, while he wasn't, you know, as active on the scene afterwards in these health things, he definitely led in that area, right? He made sure we had the support that we need. He checked in with all of us. We created teams. We did all that stuff, and that meant a lot. But one of the things that I did is I was doing I don't need to go to this meeting. I'm not going to go to it. I'm not going to go to it. And then I thought, I just got promoted. I got to kind of set the tone and make it okay for these young guys like Johnny and like Swintz. They only got a couple years. I got to make sure it's okay for them to go. So I guess I'll go. And I sat in a meeting. I'm going to tell you, your spouse goes to the rescue with you. And if you haven't gone to the rescue, and I'm going to shamelessly plug away for these guys, sit in there and stare at your wife's face or your spouse. And if you don't care what's going through their mind, then you married the wrong person. But I stared at her and I went, oh shit, we should be in this room, right? Like I went for one reason, I went back for another. So it's hard to say what leadership should do. If you're truly leading, you should lead from the front, though. Make it okay, make it available, have those conversations, never discount the tailboard. Like sit on the back of the truck with new people. Just because it's nothing to you doesn't mean that that's not something for somebody else. Take the time. It's worth it.
Yeah, so I kind of have one, and it's up to you if you want to go into this one, but kind of you had it in your class, didn't really hit it this much. But I know through the process it bothered you a little bit before you found out like she was good and able to walk, was what she told you when you picked her up, and kind of what was going through your head there. I don't know if you want to share that here. I know you haven't.
Yeah. So I'm just obviously extremely thankful how this turned out. So one of the things that happened was there were two children lying head to head. I pronounced one of them and I picked the other one because she looked the worst. And that's what our job is, right? Like that's literally what's written in the book. It's what you do. I executed it. When I picked her up, my finger went in an exit wound, and I picked her up off the ground because in my mind, there's just hallways filled with kids that look like this. There's a lot more triaging to do. We're going to get her out to a truck. And as soon as I picked her up, she looked at me and she said, now I can't feel my legs, because when I moved her, I paralyzed her. So there was some guilt attached to that obviously worked through, and obviously her being just an absolute animal, of awesome human being, and just working through it. I'm sure that is incredibly helpful that she's not paralyzed for sure, and that she's just a sweetheart of a human. But that would have been something that I'd have to live with, you know. So that's a thing.
Yeah, and that's something that you hear happens through car accident stuff.
Mhm.
Is there some advice you could give to some of those people that might have dealt with similar situations where they're playing that what if game, like, if I didn't move them in that, do a rapid extrication, maybe, they'd be fine, or
Yeah,
something along those lines?
and that was the thing that a couple of the guys struggled with, because we had trucks getting stripped off at the road because kids ran out to them and did things. And I won't get into the operation of it because that's not really what we're here to talk about. But like, we had people struggle with this. Hey, what if I would have done this? I would have been able to transport this other person if I wasn't here. The thing that you got to do, and this is where after action reports, and I don't know why people are so slack on these things sometimes, but like true timeline after action reports are one of the most, you have to go over the call afterwards in great detail. And then you have to do it again and again and again. time apart so that you set all the details there so that you know. And what you're really doing is drawing a timeline and a current event that you did everything that you would do again with the information that you had. Right? You have to be able to set yourself back in that slot. And for me, that was what was very helpful. These other guys were, man, if I wouldn't have taken this other kid that should have been transported, well, that was the only kid you knew that was there. It was the only one that you knew that was there. So the information that you had, you treated a critically ill kid. Good for you. And I had to say that to these guys over and over and over again. All right, you're still questioning yourself? Let's sit down. You're playing the what if game? Let's sit down and draw a timeline on it. Let's fix it. Let's fix it through knowledge. Let's fix it through education. Let's fix it through truth. Because the problem is, and that we're all guilty of this, is if you have a partial story, right? So sometimes it's actually a funny proven thought. Like we fill in the blanks. Our eyes are actually designed to do it. If you move your head too fast, you actually just imagine the thing that you saw in between point A and point B, and you fill it in. You do the same thing when you're up in that polyvagal syndrome and you're doing these high acuity things, you get blind spots. Like in this call, I walked in to go check on a person while I was triaging, and in my mind, I counted steps. I don't know how many firefighters in here count steps, but there were 6 steps to this girl that I unfortunately was unable to help. And then I came back. When I went and walked through the school and did the walkthrough of it, it was like 50 yards. It wasn't 6 steps. So what do our incredibly negative selves do with voids in information? We fill it in, right? But what do we fill it in with? Because we're so brutally optimistic, right? That's all of us. No, that's sarcasm. We fill it in with the worst case scenario. So what you have to do is draw a clear picture of what actually occurred so you don't give people the ability to fill in that gap with whatever our horrific nature is, right? Like, think about it this way. There's no reason why any of us would think about the worst calls that we ever went on, because there's so many good ones that blanket them. But that's what we do. We fill in this gap with garbage, right? Like you question picking her up. Well, how the heck else do you get her off the floor, right? At this point, we still think there's an active shooter in the building. Got to remove her from the threat. She lived, right? Like these are all very positive things, but you're going to focus on the negative and fill in the blanks. Did I do something wrong? But I really think that timely after action reports and then repeating them and hearing what people are saying. If somebody says, yeah, but what if? Hear them and then fill in the blank for them. Don't let them.
That's great. So we got a lot of peer support team members on here. You mentioned going through a lot of these, right? I would imagine you did. Is there any advice?
All sorts of stuff.
Yeah. I would imagine you did go through a lot of them. Is there any advice you would give to these peer support members doing in situations like this?
It's one of those things because there's a lot of proven science of like why you need to be there. Like right afterwards. And one of the things that our chief did that just amazing is by the time we got back to the station, they were sitting in our station making coffee. And I was mopping blood out of rigs and cycling crews, and they couldn't stop me from working if they wanted to. And they tried. Hey, why don't you come over here and talk to us? Nope, got stuff to do. Got to take care of the city, But I tell you what, they're doing an amazing job. Just knowing that somebody's there. The biggest thing that we've ever done on that side of it, and I don't mean this to be negative towards any other type of provider in the room, but peer support, right? Like that word peer is incredibly important. We are bullheaded, angry, silly people that don't listen to anybody if they haven't gone through what we went through. So having humans wearing uniforms that do this job, standing there, very just kindly saying, hey man, you good? I'll just sit here, and even just like having them sit in the room, like just listen. I don't have any advice because that's not my world, right? I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, but I can tell you that you're incredibly appreciated. And that for some of our guys, it really did make the difference. Don't beat yourselves up because just remember, we're all jerks and 9 out of 10 of us aren't going to listen to you. But if only one does ever, that's what you're here for. That's what I tell myself about going through this whole thing. If 50 people don't like the presentation and one person takes something out of it and their life gets a little bit better from it, it's worth putting myself through this. And the same goes for everybody out there doing your jobs.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That's all the questions we have on here, Manisha. I don't know if Mike or anyone's got anything.
Awesome. Yeah, wait, Mike, you've been amazing co-host. So thank you for being here with us. Did you have any final comments?
Just appreciate you coming on, being honest, being open. I think that's one thing that we've talked about a lot is the fact that people are starting to be vulnerable. They're starting to tell their stories. And I think that's what's really going to kind of change the stigma behind it and change, the openness that we have with talking about these things, whereas for many years we didn't. And I think it's, people like you who decide you're going to bare your soul to people. And as scary as it is, those are the things that actually help the people the most is those personal stories. So, I think it's amazing you came on here. Appreciate your time on here. It was awesome to meet you, listen to your story. So, I mean, you're doing good things. So I appreciate you coming on.
Appreciate it, Mike. Thank you.
Absolutely. I second that. Justin, thank you so much for being here. We had a final comment that said, thank you so much for stepping up and sharing your story. And that could not have been the perfect ending comment because what your 22-year career has taught you, sharing that with us, sharing this experience with us. Thank you so very much. And I will leave a lasting clinical notes before we hop off, guys. Listen, trauma, stress, it's very real and you will feel it not only in your brain and your mental health, but you'll also feel it in your body. And so these are signs of where you need to listen to yourself. You need to kind of make sure that when you're talking to yourself about and you're checking in with other people, you're also doing that with yourself. So remember, you want to put into your bucket as well, because the best way to be able to help others is to make sure that we are helping ourselves and making sure that we are good as well. And so we want to remind people of that because stress and trauma will weigh on you. And it is so important that you guys are healthy enough to help yourselves. We're doing really amazing work in the state of Michigan, thanks to the help and the commitment from all of our partners. We thank you so much. We know that a lot of our academies kind of get a bad rap with doing things, but we do also know that they're changing and they're creating new things and they're putting mental health now as a priority. And so we thank them for that as well. So thank you guys for being here each and every month with us. Again, reach out to fst5.org if you want to know more about the program. If you need someone to talk to or in the middle of a crisis, please call 833-34-STRONG, 833-347-8766. We are so thankful to have you here. We will see you guys again next month. We will actually be a little bit earlier in the month next year, just like how we were this month. Next month, not next year, so that we can make sure that everybody has time for a good holiday and you're not missing anything there. But our goal is to promote mental and behavioral wellness. We want you guys to be the most whole and healthy parts of yourself. And we will continue to do that with everything that we have. So thank you guys so much for joining us and have a wonderful night.